Thank you very much for turning up at the Maxon booth. And thanks to Maxon for having me here. It's always an absolute privilege and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you. I want to say a big thank you to those who are tuning in on C4D Live. Whether you've stayed up or got up especially, I appreciate it. And so my name, as Matthias said, is Andy Needham. I'm a freelance motion designer based in London. And I'm sort of a bit more active on Twitter and Instagram, where I'm going to post a few sort of little sketches of little ideas that I have. And what I want to do is talk to you today. I'm also a lynda.com author as well. That's a very important part of my life. I create training for Cinema 4D, After Effects, some Nuke, Illustrator, things like that. And the courses I do kind of focus on getting people up and running with Cinema 4D, getting the fundamentals down before, giving you the confidence to dive into projects that can be sort of more challenging. And I've just released training for XParticles version 4, which I'm really excited about as well. So what I want to talk to you today about is, of course, Cinema 4D, and it's my favorite tool, the kind of the best tool a motion designer could ask for. It's kind of, the reasoning behind that is because on a recent project for a major soft drink company, who I actually can't say the name of, and I've had to mask the identities of these people. The result of this was all done for a sports competition in Europe, and so these are all football players, very famous ones, and the final output were animated GIFs. So the look of it is it's 2D, but I'm using a 3D tool to kind of enhance the general look and feel. So I'll get into a few of these examples, and the first one we're going to talk about is this King one, where we're using a kind of 3D rotoscope technique to bring in a crown, make sure it lands on a head that's kind of roughly object tracked, and I'm going to talk about how I modeled the crown and some of the sort of render settings as well. So let's just jump into C4D and get into that. So this is the scene. So if I just play through, and I appreciate it's a bit sort of difficult to see, but like I say, I can't show the identity of the player. So what will happen with this is I'm bringing the footage into Cinema 4D and putting it on a plane, and to get it to line up one-to-one, I make sure that my render settings are set to the dimensions of the image. So in this case, 2160 by 2160. You can see that here. And then what I can do is bring in a camera, and with the Z coordinates, I can back it up the exact same amount. And then I can use some geometry from the content browser, which is a really useful resource that's available to anyone who has C4D. Is that better? Yeah, thank you very much. And so in the content browser, there's a lot of models and presets and things like that that you can use. So you can search for the sculpting tools, but in this one it was the male bust. And I just brought that in, took off the default material and scaled it up quite a bit, and roughly positioned it to line up with the head. And to get the texture onto that, this is why I'm setting up the camera in such a way. I can bring in a texture of the footage, drop it onto the model, and then use some camera mapping to get it to line up. Now from there, it's just a case of using the coordinates here just to manipulate the position and rotation values, and then that should all just sort of travel along. So as we play through, you'll see that it sort of comes along with the head. And if I just turn this off, it should just play back a bit quicker. So it's enough for my needs. It's got the right kind of movement, and it kind of feels about right. So now I want to get the crown coming in and landing on his head. So the crown was quite interesting one because I wanted to model that. Excuse me. And it started off as just this basic spline, just to kind of get the rough idea. And to model that, I was using the polygon pen, which is a very useful tool. It's very important to make sure you're in an orthographic view because it's going to project the points that you draw in space. So if you're in the perspective view, you might look to the side. It might look fine from one angle, but then to the side, you'll have all these points everywhere. So switch to something like the front view is going to be good for this because we can see our spline okay. And if I just zoom in here, it's important to have point snapping on, which is the vertex snap. And I'm in point mode as well, which is this icon over here. And now I can just see, if I hover over it, it's going to snap to that vertex, and I can start to begin to actually draw out the geometry. So I'll just do a few examples here, and I'll just bring that down. I haven't got a point there, so I'm kind of just guessing. So bring this over, and we can start to work our way around the shape. And we'll come over and create one here. And it's really just kind of sort of trying to describe the shape as best you can. And now, what I want to do is I can split this up. So I'm just clicking in the middle just to make more points. This gives me a point that I can bring down, so I can start to make another polygon from here. And as you see, it's very quick and easy, and you can start to build up the shape gradually. Once that's done, let's just take a look at the segment here. You end up with something a bit like this. Now, to turn it into the actual crown, we'll come back. I'll just hide what we've done here. Come back into perspective view. We don't need to see all these bits anymore. And let's just frame that up. So this is the segment that we were just looking at pretty much. And now we're going to start to build up our hierarchy to build this out into the crown shape. So the first thing I want to do is mirror this. So you can use a symmetry object, which is one of the generators. So it's going to take whatever's a child of it and mirror it on an axis. So we'll add that. Step one. Now we're going to add subdivision surface just to smooth out the corners here, add some more detail. And to get a bit of thickness, we can use a cloth surface. So now you can see we're sort of getting some thickness on that there. And you can control that in either a positive or negative direction. It's going to go kind of crazy if you push it too far in this instance, but just dialed it in to the right amount. And now we want to make more segments, more actual copies of this. So a cloner, which is one of the MoGraph tools, you associate that with motion graphics, but you can also use it for modeling as well. So anything that's repeated, you can quickly do that. So I've got this cloner set up to do linear clones, and this is the mode that we're in. If I enable it, you'll see that we have 7 copies, and they're just being pushed out along the x-axis by this value here. So great, we've got a line of clones which don't look like a crown shape. So we need to figure out a way of getting them to wrap around, and thankfully there's a deformer just for that. It's the wrap deformer that you can find here. If you're not familiar with these deformers, there's a lot in there, and each have different uses, and there's a really great series on Cineversity that will go over all of these and give you just the knowledge and confidence to know how to use them in certain situations. So with that, looking at the hierarchy of this, it has to be a child of it, but because to get around, normally you would, if we just digress for a second here, normally you would make something a child by just holding Shift and creating it. With this particular hierarchy, we need to come back and add in a null object, and then it becomes like on the same level of hierarchy, so it will then affect it. So we'll enable it, and you can immediately see that we have now this crown shape. And if we jump into the properties of that, you can see what we've got happening here. It's wrapping it around in a cylindrical mode. We can also use a spherical as well. And all you need to do is sort of dial in the radius to kind of get the crown to look not distorted and look right for the geometry. So the next thing we can do is add a bit of animation to this to bring it in an interesting way. So I'm animating the movement. You can see by this red indicator here that there's a keyframe, or the property has been changed on that. So you can see if I back out a bit, when we play through, it's just kind of spinning down and sort of animating in, and that just added a bit more sort of visual interest. The rotation is actually done on the main parent null object here, and all I'm doing is just animating the heading. So if I press Shift F3, that will bring us into our timeline, and in the F curves you can start to finesse the ease and the ease of that animation, and kind of get it to sort of smoothly finish off its movement. So we'll come back into the main setup. Now, if I show the crown that's on his head, I can play that through. And because of this hierarchy that we've been talking about, it's one of the key things if you're learning Cinema 4D is to understand the hierarchy and the way that objects can inherit properties from their parents. So we've got all the animation happening on the male bust. Anything that's a child of that is going to take on those properties and then start coming along for the ride. So that's how the crown lands on his head, and will track along with all the movements of the head. So to get the look and feel of this, I'm using Sketch and Toon. If I press Command R, I'm going to render in the viewport, and you'll see that certain things disappear, and and we've just got this crown that we're left with. Now, appreciate what I'm going to just mention now is that I used the render, the result of this in my composite, and actually keyed off the green that you see here. But green on green isn't going to be very good if you've done any keying. So that's because the brand colors were not green; they were something entirely different. So what we can do, I'll just show you how we've set that up. So I'm matting out the geometry of the male bust here with this color. So we can change that to something a bit more, maybe you just go for blue. And so now what we want to do is make sure our background color is blue as well. We can come into the Sketch and Toon settings. In the shading tab, the background color, you can really quickly drag and drop colors from one place to another, and now we've got that set up. So this will make a bit more sense now if we can see, just render that view through. So we just key that off. Now, you might think, if you experience with C4D, like, why didn't you just use object buffers or something like that? Now, they are set up on in the compositing tag, which is a really useful tag for really manipulating the result of the render. You can say, I don't want this to be seen by a camera, I don't want this to be seen by certain render effects like reflections and ambient occlusion, but you can also set it up to be an object buffer, so you can isolate it in post-production. So I want to show you the reason why, and if I enable the settings here, the multipass settings, what I need to do is add an object buffer, and all it's looking for is the same group ID that you've set up on here. So 1 and 1 will match up. And if we just come through, maybe just render a frame to the picture viewer and come over to the layers. Now that's just going to take a second. So you can see what we've got here, and you can see all those sketch effects which are coming along from Sketch and Toon. If I enable single pass and switch over to the object buffer, they're not going to come along, so they will just be cut out and lost. So you can see there, I'll lose all these fine details that are happening here. So that's the reason why I chose to sort of key it off. So we'll be going through Sketch and Toon quite a bit throughout this, so I think I can just move on to just the final part of this example. Now, I wanted to talk about a really useful function, and you notice this tag that we have up here is an XPresso tag. That's a kind of visual kind of programming language in a way. It's all node-based, but you can set it up in a simple way. And the reason why I'm using this is for the branding. It was very important that there was a particular color on one side of the crown and another one on the other side of the crown with something separating in the middle. So what we can do is have control over that by setting it up in this way. So I can visually either animate or manipulate these, these null objects here to choose where that is, and that's all set up in the material that we have. We're using a gradient, and you can right-click on the start and end points and just choose to go into the expressions, and you can say set driver, and then on the object that you want to be the driver, the other object, you can come in and say set driven, and so that will create this expression for you. And what it does is it takes the property, it puts it into one of the most useful nodes in XPresso, the RangeMapper, which is saying I'm going to translate from one value to another, and you don't have to worry about how I'm doing it. So it's just some magic under the hood. So it will take it can take angles and turn them into something else. So so like I said, you can come back in now and then just choose where that gradient is going to be. So we'll come back into the presentation, and let's just watch that through again. So you can see now the crown lands on the head, and we've got it all tracking along and looking nicely there. So let's move on to the next one. And this is just a simple example, really, of getting this Polaroid that's coming out was used as a device to wipe off elements that were actually part of the main branding. So they have been stripped out of this example. But just to show you the example, I'll just dive into Cinema 4D once again. Now, I appreciate if you're a seasoned user, this might be a little bit basic, but if you're brand new to Cinema 4D, there's some really useful fundamentals and techniques that you can take away from this. So this effect is being driven by a spline, and if you've ever used Illustrator, they're just called paths in Illustrator. So Cinema 4D calls them the splines, and all the spline tools are up here. What I did was I used a pen tool to just draw out a spline, and I'm just clicking and dragging and making points. And then from there, you can come into your point mode, start using your move tools, and manipulate the points in 3D so that you end up with something a bit more interesting. It can move around. And to get the object to follow along with the spline, it's a simple tag called align to spline. So you can, all it's looking for is the spline object. So you just drag that into the field, and then from there you can choose the amount that you want the object to move along the spline. So you animate the position, and so you can see that at 0 it's going to be at the start of the spline, and that's color coded. We've got this white start here and the blue ending. And if we play through in the perspective view, it will just follow along with that spline and travel along, and you can really kind of art direct an element across the screen. You'll notice that there's a bit of deformation happening on the object as well. Now, that's set up with a bend deformer, and like I said, there's some really useful information about that on Cineversity. So let's just look at the setup, because setting up deformers can be a little bit tricky, because you need to kind of know what axis they're going to act upon. So we've already seen in that simple example of how we'd add a bend deformer. And to repeat it, we have our plane, the geometry that we want to deform, and holding down Shift, I can just create that bend, and it will become a child automatically of the object. So we'll jump into the object properties. And I want to set up the plane in a way, actually, that makes it a bit more simple, so we're not having to mess around with rotations on the bend so much. So I'm going to set up in the -z axis, and then come into the bend, and just in the coordinates, just choose 90 degrees on the heading. And that's going to change things around a bit. Now, it's still not lined up, so it's not going to do what we want to do, but there's a really useful button here called Fit to Parent. So once we click that, it's going to snap and change its properties over, and then you can start to manipulate the strength, and it will bend over nicely. Now, the reason why it's bending nicely is because you actually have enough segments on the plane. So if I press NB, you can now see that there's a lot of geometry there, and without it, we would get a really sort of harsh result. So you can actually change. You can imagine if you can use these in modeling as well, and you can really get some interesting shapes, and it can save you a lot of time as well. So the last thing on this one I just want to mention is I'm using the Grayscale Gorilla HDRI light kit to light the get some reflections happening on this as it passes by the camera. And if I press Alt-R just to bring up the interactive render region, you'll notice it's nicely blurred out. And that's one good thing about this rig is that you can, as it comes in by default, you can see that it doesn't actually have a blurry reflection. And to me, this didn't look quite right. I didn't want to have this harsh light coming here. So you can just blur out the reflection and just dial it in as you see fit. So that was just the last little point I wanted to make on this one. So there it is once again. He takes his selfie, and then that comes by. Next one is this salute one, where we're going on this kind of sort of crazy camera journey, and there's some interesting methods in here as well, and we're kind of building upon what we've already done. So let's just have a look at that one. I'll just jump into the project file, and to play this back, we've got several instances of 2K PNG sequences. So I'm actually going to come into the material and just for the benefits of this demo, turn off the animate preview, which is actually off by default. But it just means if you bring in an animated material into Cinema 4D and have this checked on, you can see it play back in the viewport, which was very important in the first example where I'm lining up the head. So I'm going to turn that off, and that just means that we should get better playback. So if I just play this through and click into my perspective view, now we can see. Let's just focus on this this star that's moving through the sequence here. So again, using those spline tools that we have here, I'm drawing out a spline that that sort of comes around and is weaving in and out of the clones. So the cloner is actually being the camera is being created using this align to spline tag again, and the camera path is being generated from the clones. So there's a really useful MoGraph tool called the tracer, and so that's going to look at these clones that we have here and take a point from each one. And we get this sort of nice camera path that we can, if we look in this view here, that the camera's going to follow along with, like so. So there we have it. Now coming back into here, let's just talk about this shape that we've got going on. So the sweep is one of these generators that uses a spline and another shape to sort of push along as a profile to push along that spline. And so you end up getting this interesting looking thing. But there's a lot of options inside here that allow you to change the details of it. So you can manipulate the scale. And this is, if you look at this this little chart here, that's based along the length of the spline. So at the beginning we could change the scale down like so. You can also change the rotation, and it's really intuitive. Allows you to kind of certainly art direct and get different looks of it. Now I'm bringing this on and off using start and end growth, so that as it animates through, if we start it up here, you can see as we come along, it's also taking itself off again, so that we get to see a bit more of that spline traveling around and coming through. Now, going back to materials and Sketch and Toon once again, I'm coming into here. I'm actually just using another gradient again, and it allows the way I've got it set up allows me to change where the colors are, and as I manipulate these little things called knots here, the gradient will change accordingly. And again, going back to sort of branding reasons, that means I can start to make sure certain colors are in the right positions. This isn't the default setup. So to get to more of the gradient tools, and you can actually sort of save and load presets as well. What we're doing is saying we're just changing the interpolation type from something that would be smooth normally to no interpolation at all, and that just means we get these colors which kind of start and stop, and like so. Now, I'm also using a hatch shader to get some interesting kind of lines happening as well, as that are just sort of randomly placed along this thing here. So there's also some supplemental splines in here, and they were using a different setup called MoSpline, one of the MoGraph tools. If we come into that example, the MoSpline just allows me a little bit more flexibility to manipulate the curve and the bend and the twist. So if I wanted to change my mind about the look and feel of this, I wouldn't have to redraw a spline. I could just simply manipulate some sliders and do it that way. So coming back in, you can see they just add, if we look at the main example, as they come at the camera, they're just kind of filling in some gaps and making it look a bit more full. So, oops. So moving on, I'm going to come on to this magician GIF, and on the day he didn't actually have anything in his hand, so it was very difficult to actually to sort of figure out what's going on here, because he's got his fist just doing this movement. And so I'm thinking, well, what kind of 3D shape is like a fist? And I used a cube because it's kind of very boxy. So we can start to line up his knuckles with the edges of the cube and begin some basic object tracking. So let's have a look at that. I understand this would be you have to use your imagination, but obviously on the day I could see the proper footage, so I know where his hand is, and I've left a little bit here in at the bottom. It might be very difficult to see, but you kind of get the idea that I'm lining up this cube with the hand, and then again, as before, just coming in and manipulating the position and rotation values so that it travels along, so that the one that I eventually put in his hand travels along with it. And it again comes back to that hierarchy concept where the child objects are going to travel along with the parent. So let's look at the wand in isolation, because it's kind of interesting here. So now the cube is looking as it does, like this, because I actually have a display tag on it, and this means I can sort of only see the lines. I've got it set up to be lines wireframe, and I wanted the lines to be a different color, so you can come over to the cube in the basic tab and just change the display color to something like so. So that just meant I could just see those lines. I wasn't distracted by any other sort of faces of the geometry. So to bring the get the particles on here, I'm using XParticles, and in the main setup I'll come into that. I'm not really going to get into the whole XParticles setup, but if you want to see me at the booth, we can certainly talk about that afterwards. I'll just show you what I did, because I wanted the XParticles emitter to travel along with the wand. So what I've got at the tip of the wand is this little target, and it could be anything really. It could be a null object, but I chose to just use a simple plane, and it's so tiny. There it is. But like I said, it could have been anything. So what I've got is what I want to do now is attach the XParticles emitter to that. So I'll create an emitter, and so let's just find out where that is in 3D space. It's over here at the origin. So, oops. So if we just press play, that's not doing it. That's just playing through, doing its thing, and we just want to set it up accordingly. So I'll just choose the object and sphere, and to get it to travel along with the wand, we can use one of the character tags. Now, you may not be familiar with the character sort of panel, but there's some really useful tags in here. And if we come over to character tags and add a constraint and set that up to be a position, scale, rotation constraint, what we can do is it's asking us for a target object. And as soon as we drag this target in, it's going to move over and snap to it. And because it's got all that movement on it, it's just going to travel along as well. So now we have a really useful setup here, and the particles, we can start to dial those in. So if we come back into the main scene, it's not that one. So if we come over here to here, And I'll play this through and just show the X particles that we have here. Again, it's a really simple setup. And I'm also using multiple systems just with that same constraint tag just to bring in some lines as well. And if we look at the final, with a bit of compositing, a bit of glows and all that kind of stuff, it looks kind of like fairy sort of dust or whatever. It's a nice, simple effect. Moving on to the 1, 2, 3. I'm bringing in these numbers, and the reason for this one is like if the particular player had scored a hat trick, it'd just be sort of counting up the goals or whatever. Now, the look and feel of this was to sort of be bubble text, and I was thinking of the best way of approaching this. So what I wanted to do was actually start with a bubble spline, and then manipulate that so that it would morph into the numbers. So the setup for that uses a few techniques, and if we come into that project, you can see this is what I had as the final result. So let's just think about how we get to that, because there's a fair bit to break down. So this was my reference. I just drew out some numbers. I moved that into Illustrator, and then just drew out a path. And if I press A, you can see that we've got quite a few. There's a few points here. I'm trying to sort of keep it fairly sparse, but when I bring this into Cinema 4D, and the best way of bringing a spline into a path from Illustrator into Cinema 4D is to use the fantastic CV ArtSmart plugin. So if I copy this, it's as simple as this, right? So I can copy, and I come over to my new scene. Let's just come into a new scene, and I'll paste it in, just coming over to plugins, CV ArtSmart paste. You think, okay, where is it? It's actually over here. There's a really handy little indicator to show you where it is. Now that's just because I've been a bit lazy and I haven't set up my Illustrator projects properly. So what you can do is choose Command R and bring up your rulers. And if I switch over to this tool here, I get a bounding box around my object. Coming over to here now, I can drag the origin over and set this up so it's like somewhere in the middle here, and let it go. And now if I just copy and paste, and we'll just close this scene down and just start a new one. Now if I use that same plugin again, you can see now it just comes in correctly. That's great. One thing I'm noticing here is I seem to be getting some sort of doubling of the spline, which I don't want. So I'm just going to actually bring this out of the hierarchy, delete the tag, delete that, come into points mode, and just select this point down here. Now to select all the points that are connected, I can just do UW and just delete that, and now I'm back to where I need to be with my single spline. But you'll notice as well that it's bringing in a load of different points that I don't necessarily need. You know, there's some clusters here that aren't very useful for us because we want to keep that point count manageable, because to make this effect work, the points of the objects that you're morphing have to match. So we've got this one-to-one mapping. So you can certainly come in and remove those points, but you need to kind of make sure that the kind of spirit of this thing, you know, that is actually going to look exactly the same as when you brought it in. So it would be a case of deleting points and then manipulating handles to kind of make that work. Now, to save you the pain of that, because it can be a bit of a task, I've jumped ahead, and I've got this this little setup that we have here. Now, you might, how do you know how many points you've got on this object? Well, some really useful heads-up display options. So if I press Shift-V, I can come into my view settings, and in the HUD tab, I've got them checked on here. They're not checked on by default, but we can just see what the total points we have and the selected points. So as long as I'm in points mode, you can see here in the left here that I've got 16 points on this number 3 and 16 points on the bubble as well. So they're going to map correctly. So that's great. So to start this all off, I'm going to duplicate this bubble and I'll just call it bubble for now. I'll turn these off. I want to scale this down, so in my object mode, I can scale this down, or I can just come in and just key in the size, so something small. And to start this effect off, we're going to come back into those character tags that we've just been looking at, but instead of anything like a constraint, we can just come in and use the pose morph now. So what this will allow us to do, if we set it up in points mode, it'll allow us to manipulate those points so they'll morph from one object to another. I could delete this pose that's already been created because I don't need that. The base pose is that small bubble that we've created, and now we want to add in references for the animation. So I can add in the big bubble, and it's going to give you this kind of confusing dialogue if you're not familiar. So do you want it to be an absolute reference or relative? And for this one, I don't mind it being relative, and I'll bring in the number 3, and I want that to be absolute. Now I'll explain why. The end effect of this is it needs to look exactly like that 3. If it's a relative mix, if I come over to the Animate tab, you can see that it's actually mixing the bubble and the 3 and going way beyond the bounds of that 3. So we're losing our control. So I'll come over and change that to absolute. And now when we're back in the Animate tab, you can see it's exactly how it should be. We can start to animate this now, and it will mix those between those poses. So if I just remove this one, and you can see I'm morphing from a small bubble to the number 3. So I'll create a keyframe and do some animation there, and that's all fine. It's doing that. But now we can mix in the bigger bubble, and we'll animate that on as well. And we'll come back. And so now we're kind of getting that bubbly text. So what we can do is start to build out some geometry for this. So we can use an extrude generator. And again, going back to that hierarchy, this needs a child object. So if I hold down Alt, it will automatically become the parent of the selected object here. So we can set this up to have a bit more geometry on the edges by coming over to the caps and choosing fillet cap. And that just means that we're going to get a nice look and feel when we render this. Now, I've already got the sketch and tune effect on here in our render settings, and that's just found in the effects. So what I want to do is just maybe create a single object. We'll add some detail here. And that just means, as we saw with the bend deformer, when we actually start to manipulate this with other deformers, we can push out the geometry in a nice way, so that the result is smooth. So then we can start to just drop on our materials, and these are sketch and tune materials, so I can just drop those on. We can drop on the color. We can drop on another one as well, which is going to control a different type of line. So if I press Command R, you can see now that we're starting to build up quite an interesting look. And we've got these lines that follow quite closely. We've also got some lines that follow in a bit more sort of sketchy way, so it feels a bit more organic. So if we come into the green material, which is the one that's doing that, and look in the clone tab, what we're doing is we're cloning the original stroke a few times, and then using some variation on their thickness and the opacity and all that kind of stuff. And if you're using multiple instances or actually changing variation values, and you don't like the look of that, you can come in and change the random seed in the render settings here. So you can just manipulate that slider, and you'll achieve a different result in your render view. So if I do that now, you can see a few changes. So I'll just jump ahead to where we've got a more complete example. So this is a bit more complete. I've also added a spherified deformer in here so that I can start to sort of bulge out the number. And coming back onto the material, we're getting some interesting sort of shading on this through, again, those sketch and tune effects layered up this time. So I'm using a cell shader, and that's reacting to lights. And so if I've got this light here in my scene over here. If I press Alt-R so we can see what's going on and move the light around, you can see now that material is going to be reacting in a different way to where the light is positioned. And also, the spots that we have on here has this tab, this little section here that will react to the lights as well. So we'll get a sort of certain concentration of spots where the light is, and it will fall off nicely. There's another interesting thing in this material setup where if you use the bump, you can have a material in your bump channel as well. And if we just zoom in a bit and turn that on, you can also break up the pattern in a kind of interesting way. And this kind of looks like a sort of maybe a bit of a sort of paint splat or something. But ultimately, I didn't use that. But it's nice to have that control. So I'll turn that off and get back into our look here. So we'll just jump back into the main setup here, and if I just play through, you can see that we've got some sort of trails happening as well, and they're kind of following along with the numbers. It just sort of added a bit more to it, gave it a bit more life. So the setup for this is quite simple. It's using a tracer to get the whole effect, and we've seen that before, where the tracer was tracing clones to create a camera path. This time we're tracing the movement of this null object here, which is driving. If I just show you what it's doing, it's actually driving the movement of this number, and then you can see that a path is being drawn out from that, and that's what that tracer is doing. Now the tracer was put into a meta ball, which is a kind of way of generating blobby-like effects. So if I just turn off those clones and just change because you'll barely see it there, so I'll just change this whole value down to something which means you can see what's going on. So we've got this kind of thing, little blob, and that wasn't interesting enough for me. So what I wanted to do was then use the tracer once again to drive a cloner object. So we're saying to the cloner, look at the tracer, and then clone, in this case, some spheres onto that path. And then we're using a random effector, if we just enable that, a random effector to kind of push them out and make it a bit more interesting. So I think I'm going to have to manipulate because that's gone way too blobby now. So to control that, I can just come over to the meta ball and increase the whole value here. And if I come out of this camera, zoom in a bit, you can see that we're kind of getting these nice sort of blobs happening. And if we're to finish the effect, I'm just smoothing it off using a smoothing deformer as well. So you can see before and after. So it gives us this sort of organic blob that follows the number. Now, you'll notice when I enable the number that they're stacked on top of each other. They're both in the same space. And for rendering out this effect, that's not going to look too good. So the way around that is using takes. So the take system is a very powerful way of kind of rendering out different versions of your scene, but in a single Cinema 4D project file. I wouldn't have to break this out into a separate file and render it separately. So I've got takes set up for numbers. So if I just enable that take here, so we've got just the 1, 2, 3, and then I've got another take for the trails. And then I can just choose to render those out separately. I'm going to go over how that was set up just because it might not be clear to someone who's new to this. So from the main take, this is the main hierarchy that we have in this scene. What we can do is just come into takes and add a new take, and this will be our numbers. Now, to isolate those numbers, we can just turn on our auto take, which allows us to kind of override things. I'm going to look through the camera, and what I want to do is, this is just our numbers, so I'll hide from the top hierarchy, I'm going to hide the trails from view. So Alt double click on the traffic lights here, and now we just have the numbers coming through. And in this case, it's just the number 1 for this little example. Now we can do a new take, and you see what happened there. It jumped back to the exact camera settings that I had before because I had the override on. And we'll also be able to see the numbers and the trails as well. So this is just going to be the trail, and I'll be looking through my camera, and what I want to do in this instance is just do what I did before and hide the number. So now we have separate takes that we can render out, and it's such a powerful system and allows you that flexibility to break out your scene, but keep it all in one file, so it's easier to sort of keep track of things. So I just want to come back into the main project and just make sure I've covered that. So let's just take a look at that once again. With a bit of compositing, a bit of love there in After Effects, I can add some glows and just make this effect look a bit more magical and a bit more fun. So that was the final touch to make this, and also a bit of rotoscoping for the fingers so that they come up from behind. So that was all done in post in compositing. So that's all I'm going to talk about for those for now. What I want to move on to is using Python in Cinema 4D. It's a very useful programming language that has many applications, and it's something that I've started to get into. And you saw before in one of the earlier examples that RangeMapper node that's in XPresso. Well, there's a function in Python which mimics that. So again, we're taking a value and we're translating it into another value. So there's many applications for this, and it's very useful. But if you're new to programming and you see what this is, like what these arguments that you have to put into it, you might think, no, that's it, I'm done. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to break it down. It's going to be really, really simple, and this will break down the barrier to actually getting into learning Python in Cinema 4D. So all we need to do is just fill out these fields, really, and I think it's just best to start work through a practical example. So let me show you the final result so we know where we're trying to get up to. So what we have is this door, and we want to open it up just using code. So that's the goal. We're going to come over to our new scene here, and we'll add from the tags here, the scripting tags, a Python tag. That's going to open up the expression editor, and this is where we're going to write all our code. So we can just dock it into the viewport like so. We can also come over to the script menu and choose the console. I'm just going to clear that out. We don't need to see what's in there for now. And I'll just bring that underneath. And this allows you, it should throw up any errors that you have in your script. And so it can be useful for debugging. I'll just delete this comment. We don't need that. And just come up to here. Now, in this main function, this is where we're going to put all our code. And this is what's going to make things work. Let's just break down what we want to do. We have the tag on an object, and then in the hierarchy we have the object that we want to manipulate, which is a child of the parent null here. So what we need to do with the code is just give it directions and help it out. So we do that by setting up a variable to store the object. So this range map null. Okay. So I'll just delete this. And we'll set up that variable now, which is very simply just going to be obj. We'll keep the name short. It could be anything. Now all we need to do is say, find out the object which the tag is operating on. So OP for operating on. And then we can just say, get object. And from that, we now know where our range map null is. So now we need to navigate the hierarchy. And so we're on our range mapper. We want to go down. So there's a really simple function for that. So we're going to store where our door is in a variable called door, and from our object, we will get down. Now we know where our door is. Great. Now we can start to set up some user data to manipulate the animation. So I'm going to come over to the RangeMapper. And in this user data field area here, we can just choose to manage the data. We'll add a group. We'll bring it out here. And we'll just call this our controls. And then we'll add the data in. So if we twirl this down, we can see this is just going to be our open, close. And in the example, the data type is really important. So we want to keep it as a float data type, but to make the interface a bit nicer, I'm just going to use a float slider, which gives us this kind of thing here, so we can just slide from 0 to 100%. So we'll just choose OK, and this is how we're going to control the opening and closing, just on this single slider, nice and simple. So we can store that in a new variable called amount, and because it's on the object, we can just bring in the OBJ and just drag and drop this onto here. Now we have access to that. Next thing we need to do is to start to bring in our RangeMapper function, so we can import that. So from Cinema 4D, import the utilities as U. So we don't have, it's setting up an alias, so we don't start typing out loads of code that we don't need to remember. U is a lot easier to remember. So now we can start to bring in our a variable for that, so R, and that's going to be begin this with U, and call the function. And now all those scary little fields that we had to put in, the first one it's looking for is, well, what do you actually want to do? What's the in this case, what's the amount that we're going to start translating from? So the amount, and that's just going to be translated from 0 to 1. So the minimum amount is 0, the maximum amount is 1. And then it's now, where do we want to go to? Okay, so we'll come back onto our door, and we're going to manipulate the x coordinate. So we know that the closed is 0, so that's our minimum value, and the open is 200. So I'll set that back to 0. So our minimum is 0, our maximum is 200, and then we'll just clamp the values there, like so. Now, if we compile that, everything's looking good, that's fine. And what we need to do now is tell our door to move. So the door, its X property, drag and drop, is equal to R, which is what we've just set up. So if we compile that and execute, come over to our controls, we can start to manipulate the slider now, and it's opening the door for us. So we will animate that through. So we have this kind of linear animation happening of the door opening and closing. For me, one of the main what I love about this function is it's got another argument to it, which allows us to add some sort of easing on the animation. So all we need to do is come back into our user data and add another data type. And this is just going to be a spline. Now you can right-click in here and just choose a preset, and the cubic one looks good to me. So I'll give it a name of curve, and then we'll just choose OK. And all we need to do is add a comma. We need to do two things. We need to tell it where our curve is. And all we do again is just drag and drop. So, and then we just put that as the final argument in this function here. So we'll just we'll compile that and execute. And if we play through now, it's going to ease into that. And so you can start to manipulate this curve. You can start to do some interesting things with this door. And that was it. It was very simple to do. Well, was it simple? No. It was. It took a little bit of learning from my part, and I want to give a thanks to my friend Adam Heslop, who he's an amazing Python developer, and he's helped me out a ton with just sort of getting started with Python. So much so that I wanted to share this knowledge with you guys today, and also set up a group to do that. And I'll come to that in a second, but I just want to point out where you can learn about Python as well. This is a good place to start. It's the plugin cafe. And if you go into the Python section, you can start to... Did you want to get a picture? Yeah. It's the plugin cafe. And then you can start getting into the SDK. And you see here the utils here, that's where that RangeMap function is. I've set up a group here, a C4D Python Slack, which is where we can all try and learn this together. And we're building up a list of resources so that you don't have to go hunting around the internet for the information, because you might not even know what you're searching for. And that's usually the difficult part of it. So trying to just sort of put together some resources so that it will give people an into learning this language. And you can apply that to other software as well. Python's very universal. So here's the Slack, and you can see, the way this works. We're sharing a bit of code. Hey guys, I've got a problem, can you do this? Alex comes along and gives the code. It's pretty much open source, the way that we do this, and I want to thank anyone in there for contributing and just sort of starting to build up this community. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and yeah, it's been great. So if you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all these other things here. The easiest thing to remember is my handle. I'm called Andy, and you can find me everywhere on the internet there. And I'm also a lynda.com author, and if you have LinkedIn Premium, I believe that you actually get LinkedIn Learning as part of that. So anything on lynda.com is sort of mirrored on LinkedIn Learning. And yeah, please check that out if that's of interest to you. The final thing before I go is I also run the XParticles Challenge, which is a sort of competition open to anyone, any skill. And XParticles is a plugin for Cinema 4D, which allows you to create these amazing particle effects. And I want to show you the showreel that we put together for this year's competition, because the standard gets higher every year, and the artists that take the time to enter this competition do such a great job, and it blows me away every single time. So I'll show you this reel, and thank you once again for your time. Thanks very much. It's coming back again this year. Thanks again to the sponsors that make it happen. And yeah, thank you.